There was a small town nestled deep in the woods, where the only source of light was the moon and stars that shone brightly in the sky. In this town, there lived a young girl named Emily. Emily was a curious child who loved exploring the woods that surrounded her home. One evening, while wandering in the woods, Emily stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. As she peeked through the dusty window, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure in the corner of the room, huddled up and muttering something incoherent. Emily was terrified, but something inside her urged her to investigate further. She slowly opened the creaky door and tiptoed inside. The figure didn't seem to notice her, so Emily approached it cautiously. As she got closer, she realized that the figure was a woman, and she was holding a small, furry creature in her arms. The woman looked up at Emily and smiled, revealing a mouth full of sharp, yellow teeth. Emily wanted to run away, but she was frozen in fear. The woman continued to smile and stroke the furry creature in her arms. Suddenly, the creature stirred and let out a blood-curdling scream. Emily watched in horror as the creature transformed into a grotesque monster, revealing its true form. But just as Emily thought she was going to meet her end, the woman let out a piercing shriek, causing the monster to disappear. The woman then turned to Emily and said, "Don't be afraid, child. That monster was inside you all along, and I just helped you release it. Welcome to the coven." And with that, Emily realized that she had been initiated into a group of witches who had been watching her for a long time. From that day on, she explored the woods with her new coven, learning the art of magic and embracing her inner darkness. In a small town, there was a large, ancient tree that towered over everything around it. Its twisted branches reached towards the sky, and its gnarled roots dug deep into the earth. The tree was said to be cursed, and everyone in the town feared it. One day, a group of teenagers decided to explore the forest where the haunted tree stood. They were excited to see the cursed tree up close, despite the warnings of the locals. As they approached the tree, they noticed something strange. There was a face etched into the trunk of the tree. The face looked like it was in agony, with its eyes and mouth wide open. The teenagers felt uneasy, but they couldn't turn back now. Suddenly, they heard a faint whispering sound coming from the tree. They couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sent shivers down their spines. As they got closer to the tree, the whispering became louder and more distinct. The teenagers could hear the voice of a woman, pleading for help. They looked around, but there was no one in sight. The voice seemed to be coming from the tree itself. Suddenly, the face on the trunk of the tree started to move. The twisted features contorted and transformed, revealing a new face, the face of a woman. She looked as if she had been trapped inside a tree for centuries. The woman begged the teenagers for help, telling them that she had been cursed by a group of witches and trapped inside the tree as punishment for her sins. The teenagers were horrified, but they didn't know what to do. Just as they were about to run away, the woman's face transformed once again, this time into a menacing, demonic expression. The tree began to shake violently, and the teenagers realized they were in grave danger. They tried to run, but the tree's roots came alive, snaking around their ankles and pulling them towards the trunk. The teenagers screamed in terror as the tree consumed them, their bodies becoming part of the cursed tree forever. Years later, the tree still stands in the forest, and locals still warn travelers to stay away from the haunted tree. But some say that on quiet nights, you can hear the whispering voice of the cursed woman, still pleading for help. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, there lived a family in a large, old house. The house was said to be haunted, but the family didn't believe in ghosts. However, strange things began to happen in the house, things that couldn't be easily explained. One night, the family was awoken by the sound of scratching coming from the walls. They thought it was just a rodent infestation and decided to ignore it. But the scratching continued every night, getting louder and more persistent. The family tried to find the source of the scratching but couldn't find anything. They even called in pest control, but the exterminator found nothing unusual. One evening, the family's youngest daughter, Sarah, woke up to find a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. She screamed for her parents, but when they came into the room, there was no one there. They thought Sarah was just having a nightmare and tried to calm her down. But that was only the beginning. Every night, Sarah would wake up to find the shadowy figure standing in her room, watching her. And every night, the scratching on the walls continued. One day, Sarah decided to explore the attic of the house, hoping to find the source of the scratching. As she climbed up the ladder, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a small, dark room with scratch marks on the walls. Sarah realized that someone had been trapped in that room and had scratched their way out. She began to feel a sense of dread, as if the ghostly presence in her house was connected to that room. That night, as the family sat down to dinner, they heard a loud crash coming from upstairs. They rushed up to investigate, and as they opened the door to Sarah's room, they saw the shadowy figure hovering over her bed. But as they approached the figure, it disappeared, leaving behind a trail of smoke. The family finally realized that the ghostly presence in their house was not just any ordinary ghost, it was a malevolent entity that had been trapped in the attic room for centuries, waiting to exact its revenge on anyone who crossed its path. The family moved out of the house soon after, leaving the haunted dwelling to its ghostly inhabitant. Some say that the scratching and shadowy figure can still be seen and heard in the old, abandoned house to this day. Sarah had always been afraid of the dark. Even as a child, she would sleep with the lights on, and as an adult, she still felt a sense of unease when the sun went down. But when she moved into her new apartment, she thought she could finally overcome her fear. However, on her first night in the apartment, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, and the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. Sarah tried to ignore it, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching her. That night, she had a nightmare in which a dark figure chased her through the halls of the apartment. She woke up in a cold sweat, and the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Over the next few nights, Sarah heard strange noises coming from her closet. She tried to tell herself that it was just her imagination, but the noises continued, getting louder and more persistent. One night, she finally mustered up the courage to investigate. As she opened the closet door, she saw something that made her scream, a figure dressed in black, with a knife in its hand, standing right in front of her. But then the figure spoke, and Sarah's fear turned to shock. It was her long-lost brother, whom she thought had died years ago. He explained that he had faked his death and had been living in hiding all these years. As he told Sarah his story, she began to realize that her brother had never been the loving sibling she remembered. He had always been troubled, and when he disappeared years ago, he had been involved in a criminal gang. He had come back to their hometown to seek revenge on those who had betrayed him, and Sarah had become an unwitting pawn in his game. He had been using her fear of the dark to manipulate her, making her believe that she was being haunted. Sarah was shocked and horrified, but she knew she had to act fast. She managed to call the police, and her brother was arrested and taken away. But even though he was behind bars, Sarah knew that she would never be able to forget the terror he had inflicted on her. From that day on, she became more resilient, more aware of the dangers lurking in the shadows. But she also realized that sometimes, the most terrifying things are the ones that are right in front of us, hiding in plain sight. A group of tourists had been on a sailing trip in the Pacific for a week when they hit a storm. Their boat was damaged, and they were stranded on an unknown island. They thought they were lucky to be alive, but they soon realized that they had stumbled into a nightmare. The island was not uninhabited as they first believed. A criminal gang ruled it, and they were not welcoming to outsiders. The tourists were taken captive and locked up in a makeshift prison. At first, the tourists believed that it was all a big mistake, and the gang would soon realize that they were just innocent travelers. But they soon realized that the gang had no intention of letting them go. The gang was led by a charismatic and brutal leader named Santos. He believed that the tourists were a threat to his operation and that they needed to be eliminated. But he also saw them as a potential source of income. He decided to hold them for ransom, demanding a large sum of money from their families back home. The tourists knew that their families would never be able to come up with that kind of money, so they began to search for a way to escape. They discovered that the island was bigger than they had first thought, and that there were other settlements beyond the prison. They managed to sneak out of their cell and began to explore the island, trying to avoid the gang members who patrolled the area. They found allies in some of the locals, who were unhappy with Santos and his gang's brutal rule. With the help of their allies, the tourists managed to acquire weapons and supplies, and they prepared to make their escape. They planned to steal one of the gang's boats and sail to safety. However, as they were making their escape, they were ambushed by the gang. It turned out that their allies had betrayed them, and they had led them into a trap. The tourists were outnumbered and outgunned, and they were quickly captured. As Santos stood over them, he laughed and explained that he had anticipated their escape attempt. He had planned to use their attempt as a way to gather information about their families and their resources, so that he could squeeze even more money out of them. The tourists were devastated. They knew that they would never be able to escape, and that their families were now in danger. But then, in a twist of fate, a rival gang attacked Santos and his gang. A bloody battle ensued, and in the chaos, the tourists managed to escape. They ran to the coast, where they found a small fishing boat that had been abandoned. They quickly set sail, leaving the island and its horrors behind them. But the memories of their ordeal would stay with them forever. John had always been an adrenaline junkie. He loved the thrill of extreme sports and had traveled the world in search of the ultimate adventure. So when he heard about an abandoned research facility in the remote mountains of Eastern Europe, he knew he had to explore it. John arrived at the facility with a group of fellow thrill-seekers, all eager to explore the ruins. But as they began to explore, they soon realized that the facility was not abandoned at all. A group of scientists had been working on a top-secret project there, experimenting with genetic engineering. But something had gone terribly wrong, and the creatures they had created had turned on them. The creatures were now loose in the facility, and they were hungry for blood. John and his friends found themselves in a fight for their lives, battling the genetically modified monsters that roamed the corridors. They had to use all of their skills and strength to survive, fighting off the creatures with whatever weapons they could find. As they fought their way through the facility, they discovered that the scientists had also created a serum that could enhance human abilities, making them stronger and faster. The serum had been tested on some of the scientists, giving them almost superhuman abilities. John and his friends knew that if they were going to survive, they needed to get their hands on the serum. They fought their way to the lab, where they found the serum and injected themselves with it. With the serum coursing through their veins, they became almost invincible, able to take down the creatures with ease. They fought their way to the heart of the facility, where they found the source of the genetic experiments, a massive, mutated creature. The creature was almost impossible to kill, but John and his friends refused to give up. They fought the creature with all their strength, using every weapon they had. Finally, after a long and brutal fight, they managed to defeat the creature. As they left the facility, John and his friends were exhilarated by the rush of adrenaline and the thrill of victory. But they also knew that they had narrowly escaped death. They vowed never to take such risks again, but they knew that the thrill of adventure would always call to them. For years, the adventurer known only as the Wanderer had traveled the world, seeking out the most dangerous and challenging expeditions. He had climbed mountains, explored deserts, and braved the depths of the ocean. But he had never encountered anything like what he found on the hidden mountain. The mountain was shrouded in a dense mist, and no sunlight ever reached its summit. The Wanderer had heard stories of a great monster that lived on the mountain, a creature so vast and powerful that it was said to be a god. But he had dismissed these stories as mere legends, until he saw the creature with his own eyes. The monster was indeed immense, towering over the Wanderer like a giant among men. Its skin was rough and scaly, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. The Wanderer knew that he was outmatched, but he refused to back down. The two clashed in a brutal fight that lasted 4 hours. The monster was relentless, attacking the Wanderer with its massive fists and powerful tail. But the Wanderer was quick and agile, darting in and out of the monster's reach and striking with his sword whenever he could. The fight was evenly matched for a time, but then the Wanderer remembered a legend he had heard about the monster's weakness. It was said that the monster's heart was located on its back, protected by a thick layer of scales. But if a warrior could manage to pierce the scales and strike the heart, the monster would be defeated. The Wanderer knew that this was his only chance. He waited for the monster to rear up on its hind legs, then he ran forward and leaped onto its back. The monster tried to shake him off, but the Wanderer clung on tightly, using his sword to hack away at the scales. The monster howled in rage and pain, but the Wanderer kept hacking away until he finally managed to strike the heart. The monster let out a deafening roar and collapsed to the ground, dead. The Wanderer stood there for a long moment, catching his breath and marveling at what he had accomplished. He knew that he had faced death and emerged victorious, and that he would be forever changed by the experience. But he also knew that he would never forget the thrill of the fight, and the rush of adrenaline that had come with it. In the small town of Millfield, there was a house on the edge of the woods that had been abandoned for decades. It was said that the house was cursed, and that anyone who entered it would never return. But one day, a group of teenagers decided to explore the house and see for themselves if the rumors were true. They entered the house cautiously, their flashlights illuminating the dusty rooms and cobweb-covered furniture. At first, it seemed like any other abandoned house. But then they found a door in the basement that led to a hidden room. The room was pitch black, and the air was thick with a musty odor. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and they were plunged into darkness. They fumbled for their flashlights, but they wouldn't turn on. As they stood there in the dark, they heard a strange whispering sound. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but then they realized that it was coming from the walls themselves. The whispering grew louder and more frantic, until it was almost a scream. Then, the walls began to move. They bulged outwards, stretching and contorting as if something was trying to escape from within. The teenagers screamed and tried to run, but the walls closed in on them, crushing them into a small, tight space. As the walls shifted and pulsated around them, the teenagers realized with horror that they were being absorbed into the very fabric of the house. They could feel themselves being assimilated, becoming one with the cursed structure. In the end, there was nothing left of them but a faint, ghostly whisper that echoed through the walls. And from that day on, anyone who entered the house could hear the whispers, and feel the walls shifting and moving, as if the curse had claimed them to. Samantha had just moved into her new apartment in the heart of the city. She was excited to start her new life, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the place. One night, Samantha was awakened by a strange noise coming from the living room. She crept out of bed and tiptoed into the living room, but she didn't see anything out of the ordinary. As she turned to leave, She noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. She was sure she had locked it before going to bed. She closed the door and turned the lock, but as she walked back to her bedroom, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around, but there was no one there. She shrugged it off and went back to bed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The next night, Samantha was woken up again, this time by a loud banging on the front door. She got up to investigate, but when she opened the door, no one was there. She looked around outside, but the street was empty. As she turned to go back inside, she saw a figure in the shadows, watching her. She couldn't make out any features, but she knew it was there, watching her every move. The next few nights were filled with strange occurrences. Things would move on their own, lights would flicker, and strange noises echoed through the apartment. Samantha tried to ignore it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being haunted by something malevolent. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard a voice whispering in her ear. It was a low, guttural voice, and she couldn't make out what it was saying. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then, she felt something cold and clammy wrap around her throat, and she knew that she was not alone in the apartment. She struggled to break free, but the grip only tightened around her neck. In the end, Samantha was found dead in her apartment, with no sign of forced entry. The cause of death was listed as strangulation, but the police were unable to find any evidence of who or what had done it. To this day, the apartment remains empty, but the locals say that they can sometimes hear strange whispers coming from within, and that sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear Samantha's screams echoing through the night. Hannah and her friends had always been fascinated by the old abandoned mansion at the edge of town. They had heard stories about the family who used to live there, and the mysterious disappearance of their youngest daughter. One night, Hannah and her friends decided to explore the mansion. They snuck in through a broken window, and made their way through the dark, dusty rooms. As they wandered through the mansion, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Strange shadows danced on the walls, and whispers echoed through the empty halls. As they approached the room where the youngest daughter was said to have disappeared, they felt a cold breeze blowing through the hallway. The door to the room creaked open, and they could hear something moving inside. Hannah cautiously pushed the door open, and the group stepped inside. The room was completely empty, except for an old doll sitting in the center of the floor. As they approached the doll, they noticed that its eyes were following them. Hannah picked up the doll, but as soon as she did, the room started to shake. The floor began to crumble beneath them, and they realized too late that they had been lured into a trap. They fell through the floor, landing in a dark, damp cellar. The walls were covered in mold and slime, and they could hear strange whispers coming from the shadows. As they tried to find a way out, they realized that they were not alone in the cellar. Something was stalking them, moving through the darkness with deadly intent. One by one, Hannah's friends were dragged off into the shadows, never to be seen again. As the last of her friends disappeared, Hannah realized that the mansion was not abandoned after all. The family who lived there had made a deal with something dark and malevolent, and now that same entity was hunting them. In the end, Hannah was the only one to make it out alive. She emerged from the mansion, shaken and traumatized, but with a newfound respect for the old adage, some things are best left untouched.